During my time in college, I had a friend whose dad owned an 800-acre piece of land in eastern Texas. In the past, he had leased it out to hunters and paper companies, but was no longer doing it. He had built a cabin on the land a few years before and would let us go out there from time to time and mess around. It served as a great way to relax from the pressures of school and get closer to nature. The spring break of 1997, we loaded up our trucks and headed for the cabin. Our plans were to shoot guns, drink beer, and other things rednecks like us do in the woods. Our first morning kept us busy, cleaning the cabin and moving all of our stuff inside. Around dinner, we made a big fire outside and cooked a bunch of steaks and fried potatoes. We skipped dessert and broke open some beers. The sun went down not long after, and for the remainder of the evening, we got loaded and passed around a joint or two. At some point in the night, I heard a shuffling noise outside and went out to go check on it. The fire was barely burning at that point, and just outside of its light, I swore I could see the shape of a man standing completely still. From what I could tell, he was facing me, perhaps waiting to see what I'd do. I blinked my eyes real hard to get a clearer look, but my position and the lack of light made it hard to see clearly. The shape continued to stand still, so I decided I'd walk up a little closer in hopes of getting a better picture. The thought terrified me, but I was transfixed by the being. Or perhaps I was still too intoxicated to make a wise decision. I took 2 steps forward, but was distracted by a voice behind me. My friend had woken up and noticed the door was wide open. So he got out of bed and saw me walking around the fire. His voice caused me to jump a little, but I soon realized who it was speaking. I asked him if he saw the figure on the other side of the fire pit. He just laughed at me and said I must be so stoned that I was seeing things. We laughed it off and returned to bed. On my way, I turned back to take one more look, but the shape was no longer there. I chuckled to myself and went back to sleep. The next morning, I wrote the whole experience off as the result of too much fun and went on with my day. We spent the first half of it fishing at the big pond. Post-lunch was shooting guns and one guy's compound bow that had just bought. The beers and smoke were broken out after dinner. A game of poker was attempted but soon canceled in favor of another evening telling lies around the fire. On one of my many trips to relieve myself that night, I was spooked by the sound of a stick breaking close by and noped it back to the fire. The look of fear on my face made the other guys laugh their butts off. I tried to explain what happened but was quickly reminded that we weren't the only creatures in the woods. The reasoning seemed sound, so I accepted it. Not long after, we were standing around, involved in some deep discussion, and I turned to speak to the guy on my left. What I saw caused me to clench up so tight I could have snapped a steel rod with my sphincter. Standing within a few steps behind my friend was another man that I did not recognize. It was like he appeared out of nowhere. What made it creepier was that he was staring intently at the back of his head, almost like he was trying to bore through it with his eyes. I remained frozen stiff. The longer I looked at him, I realized he was the same being I saw lingering outside the light of the fire the night before. He was average height, with a long, unkempt beard. My friend continued rambling about whatever, unaware of his shadow. After several seconds, the stranger turned to me with a blank expression and walked away. This was when my friend finally noticed my horrified look. When he spoke, the thrall of fear was released, and I began pointing and rambling about what I had just witnessed. He and my other friend laughed at me again. There was no way I was seeing things this time. I described the man, and one of them suggested he was a Bigfoot. Despite my protests, no one was buying it, and I eventually cut my losses and shut up. However, I wasn't beat. Their mockery had made me even more determined to prove the stranger's existence. The next 2 days were quiet. No stranger. In other words, but I kept my eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. By our 5th morning, I was beginning to question my sanity. I had seen this mysterious being stalking around us twice now, and it had suddenly disappeared. I resolved to put my quest on the back burner until some new evidence arose. My friend's dad had mentioned to him an owner of one of the surrounding properties had spotted a small group of wild hogs running through his land. So we grabbed our rifles and went on a search for them. 1 mile or so, down one of the property's many roads, we came across some hog wallows and knew we were on the scent. We went up the road, now on foot, tracking them. Another mile on, we stumbled upon 3 large hogs rooting up the ground and prepared to make bacon. 2 of us chambered around as quiet as possible on our rifles and took aim. I was less than a second from saying 3 and pulling the trigger, when the loud crack of another rifle filled the air, followed closely by a burst of wood and bark above my friend's head. It took a moment for it to register that we were being shot at. A few seconds later, another crack and strike, this time even closer to my friend. We weren't going to wait for a third. The friend who appeared to be the target led us down a side trail that led back to the cabin. No more shots followed as we fled. However, instead of finding safety at the camp, the shots began again. Seeing no other option, we hopped into my truck and hauled ass out of there. This was a time just before the commonality of cell phones, so we had to drive the 20 miles to town to get help. After we explained the situation, we returned to the property a few hours later with some deputies. We approached slowly and remained in the cars when we parked. We waited to see if the shots would start again, but nothing happened. A cursory look around counted 3 holes in the cabin and another 2 in my buddy's windshield. Perhaps the worst part was that all of our camping stuff, sleeping bags and such, were spread out all over the ground. Luckily, we'd smoked all the weed the night before. Nothing was missing but a box of ammo, and strangely, my sleeping bag and a wool blanket. A theory began to form in the deputy's mind that we had stumbled upon a squatter or poacher camping out on the property for whatever reason. They acted as if they were going to let it go, but once my friend's dad, who owned the land, heard about it, he put pressure on them to start a search. This was about the time I repeated my story of seeing someone lurking around the cabin. No one was laughing now, and my story was finally being taken seriously by somebody. The search was led around the property by my friend's dad. School had already begun again by the time it took place. It continued for a full week, but nothing other than a few old camps were found. It was assumed that he knew the heat would be on him after the shooting incident, and he moved on. During the course of the investigation, several avenues were followed to ID the stranger, likely to be an escaped con, but he remains unidentified to this day. Because of the chance of another attack, our trips to the property ended. The next year, we tried to camp out somewhere else, but it wasn't the same, and our nature getaways died out. Within 5 years, my friend's dad had a heart attack and lost interest in the cabin. The paper company's lease was renewed, and the land's trees have been used to make paper and pulpwood products ever since. Each time I jot down a quick note, I am reminded of our awesome trips, and especially the odd and terrifying week that caused them to stop. I do, once or twice a year, talk to my old college friend on the phone. As far as he's heard, that crazy stranger still hasn't been caught. We sometimes theorize as to his origins and where he may have ended up. I, however, often take this much further when I'm alone. I wonder why our so-called stranger seemed to focus so much of his anger onto my friend, and perhaps, far more concerning, is he still out there, waiting for his chance to finish what he began all those years ago? This is a recounting of a terrifying incident that 3 of my friends experienced during the summer after our junior year in high school. I very nearly became part of the tale myself, but a scheduled shift at the movie theater saved me. They showed up at my house earlier that day, asking if I wanted to go with them into the woods to explore an area we had yet to search. But I had to work later that evening, so had to decline. It's been over 25 years since this occurred. Therefore, not all that happened can be remembered, but I will do my best. Looking back now at that way of life was then, I can positively say things have changed greatly for kids. My neighborhood was its own self-contained city on the edge of city limits. At the end of the 60s, some idealistic developer got the crazy idea to buy up hundreds of rolling acres of prairie and forest land out in the middle of nowhere. He created a little suburb, sprawl, for the coming rise of manufacturing, and the people needed to fill those jobs. The factories did come. Johnson & Johnson, Folgers Coffee, places such as that. But within 30 years, they would begin to leave just as quickly. The children of these factory workers found themselves separated from their peers in the rest of the city, and with nothing better to do, took to the woods surrounding them, to explore and discover nature, much as their distant ancestors who settled this land hundreds of years before. I was one of these children, and so were my 3 friends who would make the discovery on one of these journeys into the woods. Without me along, they took to the fields opposite the new highway. These stretched for miles back then, and during this summer were laying fallow. Our part of Texas rides the line between prairie land and a forest. You may find yourself walking for miles on open land, only to discover acres upon acres of woods being the next field. After walking for miles across nothing, they came upon a forested area most of us had yet to explore. A path led to an abandoned barn. When they turned the corner to look inside of it, they came face to face with the corpse of a hanged man. From what I was told later, not a single one of them believed it to be real. However, as they got closer, there was no longer any doubt. The body was that of a trucker who had parked his 18-wheeler at the nearby truck stop around Christmas. He walked the 3 or so miles into the woods and ended his life. To this day, no one knows if he knew that the barn was there or he just happened upon it. But we do know, on that hot, humid summer day, his bloated body posed a horrific sight to them. Realizing someone was likely missing him, my friends returned to the very same truck stop he had walked away from the year before and called the cops. Of course, I didn't hear all about this until the next day. Even though it did sound like an amazing adventure, I'm thankful I had to sit it out. All 3 of them went on to differing levels of illegal and emotional troubles, including battles with drug addiction. The only one left living, Stephen, has spent several stints in and out of institutions, and the last time we spoke, little of my childhood friend remained. I can't claim that the discovery of the trucker's body was the only reason for their eventual decline, but it most certainly contributed to it. I am an avid upland bird hunter who lives in Oregon. I have a Flushing dog I train to hunt, an English setter, Reggie, who I take out most weekends of the hunting season to look for pheasant, quail, grouse, partridge, or ducks. For the last 3 years, the only meat I've eaten from mid-September through the end of January has been the birds my dog and I hunt, plus the elk or deer that I usually bag in during archery season. It's something I've become pretty passionate about. 2 weekends ago was the end of quail, grouse, and partridge season, so I planned a day trip out to eastern Oregon. For those who don't know, most of Oregon is essentially a desert. The area between the Cascade Mountains and the Pacific is rainy and forested, and what most people think of when they picture Oregon. However, with the exception of a few small mountain ranges, 2/3 of the state east of the Cascades is just sagebrush, red rocks, and arid country for hundreds of miles to the Idaho border. While quite cold this time of year, it's still amazingly beautiful, with literally millions of acres of public land where there's great bird hunting. I loaded Reggie and my gear in the truck early Saturday morning, several hours before sunrise, and set off. Just at first light, we got to a big open river valley I've spent lots of time exploring, but this specific area was new to me. It was about 30 degrees, looked like a light dusting of snow the night before, but otherwise pretty dry, and would be a fairly clear day. I love these moments, maybe more than anything in life. Being the only human in a massive wild landscape without a single trail or building for miles. The isolation, the giddiness for the upcoming adventure, the feeling of exploring an area that looked the same 500 years ago, the feeling of going out to get my own food, the contrast between hot coffee in my thermos and cold winter wind on my exposed hands. All of it. Just my favorite place to be. I got the dog ready, put on my boots and pack, loaded the shotgun, and we set off along the top of the valley ridge, 600 to 700 yards above the river, looking out over the arid, cold landscape, hued by the silvery blue wolf light of early winter mornings. For those who've never seen it, watching a hunting dog work is a truly fascinating spectacle to behold. It's honestly why I enjoy upland bird hunting so much. To me, watching a really good hunting dog actively hunt for wild game birds is honestly not that much different from watching a trained dolphin or sea lion at SeaWorld or something like that. A work dog doing its job can be so focused and intelligent, it's shocking sometimes. I trained Reggie well, but so much of it is primal and innate. It's Reggie's 6th hunting season, so we've spent hundreds of days off trail exploring the backcountry, and we've really learned to read each other well. Coastal rainforests, high desert, alpine mountains, hardwood forests, farmland, swamps, marshes. We've adventured through it all together. If there's a game bird near, Reggie sells it. I can tell from how his tail moves, the frequency of sniffing, and the lateral angles of his turns. I can tell if he smells another person from how he looks back at me. I can tell if he smells a coyote, wolf, bear, or mountain lion from how he drops his spine. I can tell if he smells an elk, deer, or moose from how he tilts his head to catch the wind. He's my best friend. We're a real solid team. About an hour after we started hiking along the valley ridge, we came to a gully that cut downhill through the ridge toward the river, which we'd have to cross. I picked a route down the steep rise to the dry, boulder-filled creek bed at the bottom of the gully, where a deer trail led back up the other side. Halfway down the slope, Reggie started acting real strange. He stopped about 30 feet in front of me, cocked his head to the side, and fixed his gaze down to our left, toward a spot in the dry creek bed as it dropped down the valley. He then leaned his head forward, as if trying to get a better view, and then started turning around toward me without pulling his eyes off the spot, which he really only does when he's scared of something, like when we go to the vet or I start up a chainsaw. Then he bolted up the steep side of the gully to where I was standing. "What is it, bud?" He kept switching his gaze from my eyes to the same spot below us while pacing around in half circles. Strange. My first thought was mountain lion, which I always have at the back of my mind. They're all over the place out here, but they usually clear out long before they let people, let alone a person with a dog, get this close to them. Figured that probably wasn't it. Whatever, I thought. We've got to cross this gully and keep moving. So I patted the dog on the head and kept on moving down toward the bottom of the gully. Reggie stayed right on my heels the entire time. The bottom of the gully was a dry creek bed loaded with car-sized boulders with a lot of rocks and gravel running between the rock formations and steep grassy walls of the gully. As I was crunching over the gravel, Reggie stopped in the middle of the creek bed and, once again, was fixated on something to our left, down the gully. This time he dropped his spine, and I could see his hackles raise. Oh shit, I thought. Maybe there really is some kind of predator in the rocks down there. I flipped the safety off my shotgun and started talking to Reggie in the cute buddy tone I use when I'm trying to calm him down. I started walking toward a big boulder in the middle of the creek bed that was blocking my view. Looked like once I was past it, I'd have a clear field of view over the entire gully, all the way down the valley side to the river. Reggie was still frozen in place. I patted his head as I passed on his right side. Once I got a few paces past him, I noticed he wasn't following me, which he usually would, even if it was a bear ahead of us. I looked back at him. "Let's go, bud. What's up there? Let's go get it." Usual comments I'd make to him to get him all jazzed and excited to go check out an area. He started pacing around in half circles again, with his ears back and his tail down. What the fuck? I thought. Definitely never seen him do this before, unless, again, we're at the vet and he doesn't like shots. I've seen him chase 400-pound black bears off my property and squabble with countless coyotes. He's not scared of much. This got me pretty anxious. I shouldered my shotgun and decided that before we keep moving, at this point, checking behind the boulder where something had the dog all tweaked out was a safe thing to do. I moved fast. In my experience, dealing with cougars and black bears, 99.9% of the time you bump into one, they're absolutely terrified and run away as fast as they possibly can, especially when surprised by something with confident movement that's making lots of noise. But definitely don't do this with a grizzly. I heard Reggie start following me as I started to boogie around the boulder. I came around the big rock on the right side, and in front of me was a big clearing in the creek bed and a huge bighorn sheep, a ram no more than 25 feet in front of me. We run into a bighorn sheep out in this country all the time, so it wasn't that much of a surprise. What was surprising was how this thing was sitting. That's the only way I can think to describe it. It was sitting on its folded back legs like a dog or a cat would, holding itself up with a straight-backed posture, front legs locked forward with its hooves in the gravel, staring straight ahead so I couldn't see its face. "What the fuck?" I said out loud. These are very wary and skittish animals. They'd never let a person get this close. A bunch of things went through my mind at the same time. Maybe it's dead. No, it was cold, and I could see steam coming from its slow breaths. Maybe it's wounded and dying? Maybe it's stuck on some old fencing or something. Right then, Reggie started barking. Not just barking, but snarl barking, like he was in a fight. He's a pretty quiet dog generally, and he never barks at deer, elk, or ram. Maybe prances after them for a few seconds instinctively, if we bump into one hiking, and spook it, but he's never been very interested in big mammals. It startled me. I looked back at him, and he had his front legs splayed out. His head was down. His tail was down. His hackles were raised up so high he didn't even look like an English setter anymore. And he was fully baring his teeth and barking and snarling like I've never seen before. He looked feral, like a coyote. I could hear the snap of his teeth as he barked again and again. I looked back at the ram, still just sitting there, unmoving, staring straight ahead. Now that was strange. I've never known a wild mammal to do anything but bolt away, terrified at the presence of a canine, let alone not even move a muscle with a canine being aggressive. I was pretty convinced at that point that the ram had to be real sick or super messed up in some way. Definitely close to death. Even if it was tangled up on something or had got trapped in a leg snare, it would be freaking the hell out with the dog going ballistic next to it the way Reggie was. "Reggie, here!" I yelled to him. Here is sort of my catch-all command for him, meaning, stop what you're doing and get to my heels right now. Reggie didn't even look at me. I took my shotgun in my left hand, turned and took a step toward the dog, and pointed at the ground in front of me, and pretty much screamed, "Reggie, here." Again, nothing. He just kept barking and snarling at the ram with increasing intensity. That really put me on edge. He never just completely ignored a firm command before. It's like I wasn't even there. I turned back to the ram and shouldered my shotgun again. Something was wrong, real wrong. All my years spent in the back country, hunting and tracking big game animals. I mean, I literally guided ram hunts professionally just one valley over, and I'd never seen anything like this. The wind was picking up and howling down the gully. I felt its bite on my hands. The light dusting of snow from the night before was getting whipped up around the gully. Thin, frantic sheets and clouds of light snow that looked almost like electric bursts as the tiny ice crystals catch the light at different times. I started moving around the ram to its right, trying to gain some elevation to stay somewhat above it as I rounded its position to get a look at its face. Bighorn sheep don't attack people. They're skittish as hell, so I wasn't necessarily scared of that. But this thing seemed unwell, so I figured all bets were off. As I was sidestepping around it, the wind in the gully started messing with the pressure in my ears, as it can. Felt like I was landing in an airplane, and my ears popping slightly dulled the volume of Reggie's snarling and barking, and the wind howling down around the rocks. My heart was pounding pretty good at this point. I got to a spot around 8 feet directly to its right, and about 3 to 4 feet above it, up the slope of the gully, and could start to make out its face. My heart rate was going insane, uniquely so, to the point I actually noticed. The pressure change made it so I could hear my heartbeat thundering in my ears, and I feel it throbbing in my cheeks and eyes. Felt like I'd taken 10 Adderall, chugged a Red Bull, and then sprinted a mile. Trying to calm myself down and get a grip only made me more jumpy and anxious. I took another step and could see its mouth now. It was slightly agape, with milky snot running from its nose and saliva dripping from its bottom lip, with little spurts and flecks of both shooting out every time it exhaled a steamy breath. "What?" I kept saying out loud. I took another step and could start to see its eyes behind the big, full curls of its horns, which were pocked with scars and abrasions from a lifetime of battling other rams and existing in this hard, rocky country. I took another step, so I was able to essentially look at it from the front for the first time and see its full features. It had tears pouring out of its eyes, and it sounded almost like it was moaning. Alright, I thought. This thing is incredibly messed up. Is it a virus or something? Is its lower spine broken? I wanted to put it out of its misery, but shooting a bighorn sheep without a license is a felony with a $15,000 fine. So I started thinking about hiking back and calling the Fish and Game officers. I lowered my shotgun and was about to turn to go back toward the dog when it snapped its head up to the right and looked right at me. Until my last day alive, I will never forget that moment. All the wind was knocked out of me, or sucked out of me. It felt like I was free-falling, with my stomach in my throat. I couldn't move. I pissed myself. Just straight up urinated in my pants for the first time since I was a toddler. Tears started rolling out of my eyes down my cheeks. My hands and feet went numb. I didn't notice the dog move, but Reggie was suddenly right at my feet, with a strap for my backpack in his mouth, fiercely pulling on it as hard as he could, as though we were playing a tug-of-war, yanking me back the way I'd come. But I couldn't move. I couldn't raise my shotgun. I couldn't look away from the ram. I was stuck. Then the ram started weeping. That's the only way I can describe it. Weeping. It didn't move its body, only its head, but it was whimpering and weeping, like a person. Its facial features became very human. Its eyes bulged. Its bottom lip was quivering. It was whimpering out noises like it was trying to speak between sobs, while sucking in air sporadically, like a crying child would. Then, unmistakably, it started speaking. or more like it started pleading. It only used a total of 3 different words, but they were unmistakable. Don't go, don't go. Please don't go. Don't go, don't go, please don't go. Don't. It increased its intensity gradually, from a whimpering pleading to a desperate screaming. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was going to throw up, or had already thrown up. After what felt about 15 seconds, my dog finally yanked on my pack hard enough to get me to stumble, and I lost my footing. I couldn't move my leg to replace my foot, so I went down to one knee and then buckled forward down the slope, rolling onto a shoulder and finally breaking my eye contact with the ram. The second I broke eye contact with that thing, I could breathe again, and the sensation of falling went away. Reggie was whining and barking now, right in my face, licking my cheek between barks and snapping at the straps on my backpack shoulder straps and yanking on me away from where I'd fallen. I pushed myself up on my palms and just screamed, "Go!" to the dog and grabbed my shotgun and half sprinted, half crawled up the hill out of the gully as fast as I could. The ram's screaming was getting louder. It started to hurt my ears. Reggie was ahead of me, stopping every 20 feet or so to look at me and bark toward the noise. I could see the dog was shaking like a leaf. The screaming started to turn into a single, unbroken roar that sounded half beast and half wind. The pressure in my head was so bad that a throbbing reddish blackness flooded my peripheral vision, and I could barely see. I just kept crawling and scrambling toward my dog's barking, and eventually crossed the crest of the slope at the top of the gully and was on flat ground again atop the valley ridge. Right then, the roaring stopped. The wind died down and I felt the pressure in my head give way. The darkness faded from my vision, and the light of the day filled the world again. I stood up and jogged a short distance until a thirst like I'd never felt came over me. I collapsed at the base of a rock outcropping and called Reggie over. I took probably 25 gulps of water out of my camelback. I realized I'd thrown up all over myself at some point while scrambling out of the gully, or maybe before, and had a few deep cuts in my palms and knuckles. Reggie was still shaking like he'd just come out of an ice bath, and whining as though he was hurt. I checked him for injuries, but he seemed alright, so I gave him some water and put an arm around him, trying to calm him down just a bit. I wiped much of the dirt and snow-caked vomit off my coat as I could with my bandana, while keeping an eye and a shotgun barrel trained on the crest of the gully, expecting with a deep dread to see ram horns slowly coming over the crest. But they didn't. After a minute or so, I got my stuff together. I took another sip of water, stood up and booked it the entire 3 miles or so back to the truck, jogging the entire way. As soon as I could see my truck, I fumbled my keys out of my coat pocket, unlocked it, and bolted straight for the driver's side door. I threw the dog into the passenger seat, the gun into the back seat, and piled in behind the wheel without even taking my pack off. Fired her up, and tore down the dirt road much faster than was safe. I got to the highway and didn't stop until we were in my driveway. It's been 2 weeks since that day, and I still haven't been able to sleep a full night or talk to anyone about it. The hell would I tell people without them thinking I've lost my mind? Reggie has never liked sleeping in my bed before, but he's curled up as close as he can to me every night since. I have no way to rationally explain what happened out there. I have no clue what it was controlling or possessing that animal. But I know one thing. It felt like there was a person in that ram, somewhere. It felt like a person's spirit was stuck in there and desperately wanted out. However, based on the way my dog was acting, I also got the gut feeling that, if I did help it, I wouldn't have ever left that gully. I am sincerely terrified in a way I've never known possible. During the early 2000s, when I was attending law school, I worked nights delivering pizza for one of the national chains. I had done something similar when I was younger and attending my local community college. Anytime I found myself sorely in need of quick cash, that was the avenue I would choose. Despite the many stories I have heard questioning the safety of the job, I never had a single run-in with a thief. I'm sure back in the early days, it could be a little dangerous, but by the time I joined the game, companies had learned that implementing practices such as limiting the driver to $20 lowered the chance of holdups drastically. Even though I was never a victim of a robbery, I did have one or two scary incidents I could write about. The worst of these happened to me back in the 2000s. I was very familiar with the city I was living in at the time. Moving there after junior college and delivering for several places over the last 5 years had made me intimate with almost every nook and cranny of the place. However, one evening, I would be called to an address that I, nor any of the other drivers even knew existed. When the order came in, I went straight to the map to find the address, but it wasn't there. Not even the GPS on my phone showed it. We didn't have any no delivery areas at the time, so I had to take it despite my misgivings. Theoretically, the place would have existed if the road continued for 10 more blocks, so I turned onto said road, a block before its ending, and followed it south. Sure enough, a newly paved road began where the old one should have ended. For what seemed like miles, I continued on this new section of road. Nothing stood on either side of it, and I didn't pass another car the whole time. How the state managed to build it without a single report of its creation leaking to the media had me bewildered. The 5 years I'd been driving all over this city, I'd not known this part existed. In one way, I was very excited seeing all of it, like a Victorian explorer tracing the source of the Nile. But at the same time, a deserted road popping up out of nowhere gave me a chill down my spine. It must have been a good 10 minutes before the house in question appeared in the distance. I couldn't understand why someone would build a house out here in the middle of nowhere with no way to reach it. When I got closer, I could see the house had to be at least 50 years old or more, and probably hadn't been repaired since then. No cars were around, and for a moment, I thought the house was abandoned. But I could see the front door wide open, behind the rickety old screen. Everything looked to be above board, so I grabbed the pizza and headed for the door. I knocked on the screen door, but got no answer. I could see what appeared to be a young female walking around the kitchen. When I knocked a second time, I heard a female voice say to come in. Despite my reservations, I stepped just inside the house and waited in the small foyer area. I learned from other drivers early on to not enter an unfamiliar house, but I had yet to see anything to concern me. I assumed the woman would be coming out soon to pay me. Instead, I overheard an unseen man whisper, "Call him into the kitchen." When I heard that, I fled from the place as fast as I could. I was so freaked out, I got back to the restaurant in half the time it took me to get to the house. After I told my boss what had just occurred, he called the police. All the excitement had me rattled, so my boss sent me home for the day. My phone rang a few hours later. It was the police. They'd called to let me know what they had found. Whoever had been there was gone now. Even though the place had more than likely been abandoned for a while, they did find evidence that people had just recently been inside. This was stuff my boss had already told them. However, they did shed some light on where the road came from and why the house was the only building on an otherwise deserted area. The state had been trying to purchase the land on which the new section of road and house were for 20 years, but the landowner wouldn't sell. They even tried to use eminent domain to get it, but a judge blocked it. Around 2 years before, the owner passed, and his children finally sold the land to the state. They were so happy to get the land after all that time that construction on the road was started immediately. It technically had yet to be formally opened, but locals had already begun using it anyway. This was good to know, but I still wondered how the two people knew about the empty house sitting out there in the middle of nowhere. This was something the officer did not know. We could only assume they drove past it and decided it would be as good as a place as any to ambush a delivery driver. Even $20 is a good score if you're desperate enough. He said from personal experience, people had killed for much less. The officer left me with one good piece of news though. The county had slated the old house to be demolished in the coming week, so no other poor delivery driver would be let out there to be robbed or worse. 2 days later, I was driving down the brand new road, which I was now using as a shortcut across town, and witnessed the house's destruction. A load was being lifted from my shoulders right before my eyes. Never again would I enter a customer's home or even deliver to an area in which I was not well versed. Perhaps in the future, I'll share my other story. While not as harrowing, it was still scary nonetheless. Because my parents had separated before I was born, I spent my time growing up between each of their houses. Each summer, until I turned 19, I stayed with my dad in rural Missouri. He had grown up in the area himself, and most of his family still lived there. Without much to do, like going to the movies and stuff, I would fill my days hanging out with my older cousin and getting into mischief. Many of our long summer days were taken in wandering the surrounding woods. On one of these journeys, we came across a big lake, sitting quietly by itself out in the middle of nowhere. The water was crystal clear and filled with tons of monstrous fish. We asked the adults if they were aware of its existence, but none had heard of it. That was probably the reason for it having so many large fish. No one living in the area had fished it, and any who had in the past allowed its location to be lost. We would fish the pond 3 or 4 times, coming away with a stringer full of lunkers on each occasion. On the 5th occasion, we hoped to accumulate enough for a big family fish fry. The summer holiday was starting to wind down, and we figured a fish fry would be a great way to cap it off. It was a warm Saturday morning when we headed out. We started about an hour before sunup because the walk-in took over an hour. Besides, the fish stopped biting by the hottest part of the day, and we hoped to get back to my dad's house by early afternoon. The beautiful sight of the pond came into view just around dawn. It didn't take long for us to get our first bites, and for the next 3 hours, the fish came quickly, one after another. Our limit was caught by 10:45, and I was rearing to get going. We had a 90-minute walk back with 2 5-gallon buckets packed to the top with fish, so I imagined another 30 could be added to that. To my displeasure, my cousin thought it would be refreshing to take a dip in the lake before we left. He tried to pressure me into joining him, but I didn't know how to swim at the time. I just wanted to get back, but he was older than me, so he was in charge. I plopped my tail onto a rock and waited while he did his thing. There was an old rope tied to a tree, probably from 100 years ago, and he wanted to swing from it. It looked unsafe to me. However, my concerns were laughed off, and he stripped down to his boxers, setting his clothes on the ground next to me. He climbed the tree a little way and grabbed onto the rope. Pushing off, he swung out just a short distance before the rope snapped right above him. He'd made it out far enough to hit the deep water, but probably not as far as he intended. When he hit the water, his body made a dull thud sound. It certainly didn't sound normal, and likely hurt. I was planning on laughing at him and saying I told you so, but as seconds passed, he never resurfaced. The situation was quickly becoming scary. I looked around to see if he came up somewhere farther away, perhaps floating unconscious because of the hard contact with the water, but still nothing. I was beginning to panic and waded out as far as I dare, looking into the water for him. Unfortunately, The water became cloudy with every step I took and made it impossible to see. Soon, it was clear to me that he had drowned. How? I had no idea. Perhaps if I could have swum back then, I may have been able to help him. But it was too late now. I was helpless to do anything more than pack up and head home. On the entire walk back, a small nugget of hope lingered in the back of my mind that he had tricked me and would pop up at some point. This didn't happen, however, and the dread I carried of telling my family grew with each and every step. I tried several times to find the words, but with each attempt, I would break down and choke on my tears. Ultimately, I could only manage, "Mark drowned." They got the point after that, and once I was able to pull myself together, I led my dad and uncle back out to the pond. Mark's body was still nowhere to be found. With no other options, we went into the sheriff's office to report the drowning. When I realized where we were headed, I started freaking out. In my young mind, I thought I was going to get in trouble or be blamed for my cousin's death. It took a few moments, but they were able to convince me that I was not in trouble. Even after they had, I couldn't help but feel guilty every time I looked at my uncle. Regardless of what he claimed, I couldn't believe he didn't blame me, even if it was just a small amount. I explained what happened to the sheriff, and the search began the next morning. Just by chance, that was the day I was going back to my mom's. That Monday night, my mom sat me down to tell me that a team of divers had found Mark's body earlier that day. When they discovered him, one of his feet were hung up on a sunken log, so they assumed that was why he never surfaced. I wish I could say this made me feel better, but it did not. It did, however, serve as a catalyst to learn how to swim. The guilt of not being able to help my cousin stayed with me for most of my life, and I never wanted to be in a position of not being able to help another person, ever again. So, in a twisted kind of way, his death had a positive impact on my life. However, if I had the choice, I prefer he still be with us.